Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Rishabh Iyer, and today I'll be talking about a very important topic, that is academia versus industry. Imagine you're a graduate student who's about to graduate. You're a PhD student, maybe in your fourth year or fifth year, and at this time, a very important question that is crossing your mind is, what do I do next? A PhD student who's about to graduate has multiple options in front of him or her. The first option is that they can continue in academia, that is, they will maybe do a postdoc and eventually land up a faculty in a university. The second option is that they can actually join industry. Within industry, there are actually multiple sub options. The first sub option within industry is a research lab. A research lab is a lab where the main focus of the individual is going to be pure research. The second option is an industry lab. An industry lab, different from a research lab, is where you're actually going to be embedded in the main company, right? And you're going to be working closely with product teams and actually working closely with software engineers. So examples of a research lab are Microsoft Research, Meta Research, earlier called Facebook Research, IBM Research, Google Research. Examples of industry labs are Microsoft, Google, IBM, Adobe, so on and so forth. Unlike a research lab, in the industry lab, as I said, your main job is going to be focusing on the product at hand, and you're going to be developing new algorithms which can impact the product directly. So this is different from a research lab where again your focus is going to be mainly coming up with new algorithms, coming up with publications and basically broadly blue sky research. The last option within an industry is that you can also join a startup. So each of these kind of options are actually very different. And in this video, I'm actually going to contrast these different these different options, that is an academic position, a faculty position, a research lab, an industry lab, and a startup on 12 different points. Before going there, I would like to encourage you and request you that if you like this video, please press the like button and please subscribe to the channel. So the 12 points that I would be contrasting in this video are: first, the type of work and the focus of the work. Second, how easy is it to get in? Third, what is the focus? Is it a research focus? Are there publications expected? The fourth is funding. Do we need to get funding and grant writing? Is grant writing and funding important for the job? Fifth is the amount of effort required to put in for the job, or what is also known as work-life balance. How compatible is the job with work-life balance? The sixth option is how hands-on the job is and what are the coding skills that you will learn while being in this job. This job. The seventh is the research vision. Is it short-term research vision or long-term research vision? The eighth is the compensation. Again, a very important factor. How much is the compensation typically in each of these different kind of roles? Ninth is the job stability and the risk of the job. The 10th factor is the impact of the job to the real world. The 11th factor is freedom to do what you want to do. And the last factor, or the last point that we're going to contrast, is how narrow the job is and how much flexibility or how much breadth do you have in the role that you are doing. All right, so I'll actually cover these topics one by one and contrast each one of these different four positions that one can get into. So the first is the type of work and the focus of the work. So in academia, the major focus of the work is going to be driving a research vision and a broader research vision. So for that, you will be involved in working with PhD students. You will be involved in writing grants and getting external funding. You'll also be involved in writing publications and actually mentoring your graduate students to write publications. And finally, last but not least, you'll be doing teaching. So you'll be teaching in the university. You'll be teaching 1 or 2 courses per semester. In contrast, in a research lab, the focus is not as much on mentoring students. The focus is still on research. Your focus is still to drive a research vision. Your focus is still going to be, solving academic problems, getting publications out. But instead now you will be having interns that will be working with you for between 3 to 6 months. And during that time, you'll be guiding the intern on the project that you will be doing. In an industry lab and a startup, your work is going to be more focused towards the company. So you'll be working on probably multiple problems, but the problems are going to be very, very focused to a specific component that your team is mainly focused on and mainly going to be working on. The second point that I'll be contrasting, these is the ease of getting in. So in terms of the ease of getting in, academia and research labs are the hardest to get in. The reason is because academia is a place where you have very few number of slots per universities, depending on how big the university is and how much funding the university has. So obviously you have very, very few faculty positions compared to the number of students who graduate every year all over the US. So as a result, getting an academic job is very, very competitive, and the academic job market is very stressful. In fact, I have so many friends who have finished their PhD, done multiple years of a postdoc, but still have not been able to successfully get an academic job, or at least they have not been able to find the right fit of an academic job and had to join back industry. Research lab, on the other hand, has a few more options. But again, a research lab within any company is going to be much, much smaller than the engineering portion of that company, right? So for example, Microsoft Research, in terms of the number of employees, is much smaller compared to the number of research scientists that are there all over Microsoft. So that's the reason why getting a position in a research lab, like for example, Microsoft Research, is probably as competitive as getting a job in a top tier research company. Getting a position, relatively speaking, is easier in an industry lab and startup. The focus and the skill set required in both are also different. So in academia and a research lab, the focus is not as much on the coding skill set, but it is going to be more focused on the research side. Whereas in an academic job, in an industry lab or a startup, the focus is going to be on coding. So coding is definitely an important. So the third component is the research focus and the publications. So again, because of the way academia is, and because of the way the research lab is, your main priority is going to be publications. So as a result, it is important to publish papers, and naturally, because you're working with students, and in the case of a research lab, you're working with interns, you will naturally expect to get more publications out. On the other hand, publications is not as much a focus in an industry lab and a startup. So naturally, you should get into an industry lab and a startup and expect not to be spending a lot of time on publications. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't do publications on the side. You can collaborate with other researchers and get papers out. But it's going to be hard because this is going to be different from what your day job is. Your day job is going to be more focused on solving the real world problem and not as much on academic blue sky research. The fourth aspect is funding. Now, funding is something that is thought of to be exclusively academic, and something that faculty members are mainly going to be concerned with. This is partly true, but there is going to be funding, some kind of funding you need to get even in other scenarios, and I'm going to talk about it. But one thing I do want to mention is that in academia, as a faculty, getting external funding is one of your most important focuses. So you will be spending a good amount of time getting external funding. You will be writing grants to other industry groups. You will be writing grants to scientific organizations like NSF, so on and so forth. In an industry lab or research lab, there is still some amount of funding. In this case, the funding is you need to work with internal organizations and you need to get your projects funded. So if I have an idea that I'm going to work on a particular topic, you need to get the buy-in from your organization and from your research group. So from that perspective, there is also some funding that is required. The fifth point is the amount of effort required and the work-life balance. So, unfortunately, academia is one of the most notorious in terms of work-life balance. As an assistant professor, particularly, you're going to be expected to put in a lot of hours. You're not really expected, but it's just that there is so many things you need to do that many weeks you will be actually spending much more than this regular 40 hours a week. That's just because you're wearing multiple hats. You're a PI, you're working with multiple students, you're focusing on writing grants. Every time there's a paper deadline, you're working on multiple projects and potentially submitting multiple papers, so on and so forth, right? So academia is not really the best place for work-life balance, but having said that, it is still possible. It is still possible to be, to make sure in the interest of sanity to have a work-life balance. And personally, I would strongly encourage you to make sure you have a work-life balance, even though you're in a very crazy academic environment. Again, a startup is something that I would not expect a lot of work-life balance in. The reason is startup is typically very early stage. There is going to be a lot of work required. Like academia, you're wearing multiple hats. You will need to do machine learning. You might also need to do some kind of software engineering as well. So there's going to be fires all the time, and there's going to be production issues you need to deal with. So work-life balance may not be as much of a priority if you're going for a startup. On the other hand, a research lab and an industry lab are actually much more suited for work-life balance. The next axis, or the next point, or the sixth point, is how hands-on the role is and the number of skills required for the specific role. So an industry lab and a research lab is still relatively hands-on, even though in a research lab you're doing a project. So you're doing blue sky research, still, and oftentimes you're working with an intern. It is often the case that interns just spend 3 to 6 months. And more often than not, before the intern joins in, you would be doing some proof of concept experiments. Once the intern leaves, you might need to run some additional experiments, make sure the paper is ready. So you are relatively hands-on in a research lab. In an industry lab, obviously you're very hands-on because you're making sure that the algorithms that you work on can have an impact on the product. The same with a startup. The startup is going to be a very hands-on experience. You're going to be doing a lot of coding. In contrast, in academia, you typically don't have time to actually do a lot of coding. So you have many students who work with you. Because of just the number of activities that you're involved in, you won't have the time to work yourself on coding and writing the code for a project from scratch. You might run a few experiments, but oftentimes I've seen in academia, you really don't have the time to write code. But still, I have seen multiple people, professors who still try to keep in touch with doing some kind of coding, and I do think personally this is very important. All right, so the seventh axis, or the seventh point that I'll be contrasting this, is the research vision. In academia, you have a very long-term research vision, and oftentimes the research vision may be not necessarily focused on a particular end product or profit. Your research focus may be for social good. You might be doing research for doing maybe helping the environment, right? Or you might be doing research for using machine learning to help society. So there are multiple options of doing research, and oftentimes your research is much longer term compared to what it is in other areas. A research lab is somewhere in between. So you do have longer term research, but it is maybe not as long term as academia. In an industry lab and a startup, you typically are not very long term. You are focused exclusively on the product that you're working with, and you're focused on the activities of the product. The eighth point is probably the most important, and that is compensation. From a compensation perspective, an industry lab and a research lab would be the best bets. The reason is because if you're working in a good lab, you would be having multiple sources of compensation. Your base salary, which oftentimes is very high. In addition, you'll get a yearly bonus and you'll get stock options. Academia, on the other hand, is probably the least in terms of compensation because just by default you have a 9-month academic salary, at least in the US. You can write grants, external funding, particularly NSF, DARPA, so on and so forth, and use your funding from that to fund yourself for the summer. But even if you take the summer compensation into account, you're oftentimes probably much lower than what you get in an industry lab or a research lab. A startup is more risk, so you can end up, if you're lucky and the startup becomes a unicorn, you can end up making a lot of money, but upfront you will not get a lot of money. You might get more stocks. The ninth point is job stability. From a job stability, academia is the most preferred option. The reason is once you have tenure, you really cannot be fired unless you do something really wrong or you completely slack off. Like for example, you don't teach a class that you're supposed to teach. So a tenured position is actually one of the safest job positions in the US. So in terms of job stability, academia is probably the best. I'd like to qualify that by saying that if you don't have tenure, if you're an assistant professor, you still have to go through the tenure process. So there is some uncertainty there. Startups are probably the worst in terms of job stability and the riskiest, because just the way the startup is, you really need to you really need to deliver, and the startup just cannot afford to have someone who is probably slacking out, right? A research lab and an industry lab are somewhere in between. The second last point that I'll be covering is the impact on the real world. So how much the work you do would actually impact the real world. So in my opinion, academia is kind of a mixed bag over here. A lot of groundbreaking research that comes out actually comes originally from academia, oftentimes, right? And what this basically means is that you're coming up with a new groundbreaking algorithm, and this groundbreaking algorithm can revolutionize a field, right? And this can then have impact in multiple areas. But as such, when you're working in academia, you're not working on any specific real world problem. You oftentimes don't work with even real data sets, right? You work with kind of academic data sets, which are, basically available to you. You don't really work, that have already been curated and, cleaned up. You don't work with real data that, a particular company generates. So from that perspective, academia is you don't have as much of an impact of solving a specific real world problem. On the other hand, in an industry lab, you are working specifically with a product, and for that reason, the algorithms that you develop would be shipped eventually to that product. So you can actually see the impact of your algorithms. You can actually measure quantitatively how much impact your algorithm has in terms of, say, efficiency, in terms of revenue, whatever it is, right? A research lab is somewhere in between. Because you're working in a research lab, you are working on a new algorithm, but you can collaborate with product teams. And in fact, you are strongly encouraged to collaborate with product teams so that the algorithms that you develop can actually be used eventually in real world problems, in collaborating with the product team within the company itself. A startup, obviously, you have a lot of impact on real world. The next topic, which I think is one of the most important factors why folks join academia, is the freedom. What I mean by freedom here is the freedom to choose the topic you're working on. Academia has the best options in terms of freedom. If I want, particularly if I'm tenured, say I'm working today on machine learning, I really strongly feel to switch my application, say from computer vision to climate research. I can do this overnight. No one is going to question me, right? It might take some time for me to establish myself in climate research, but if I'm really passionate about climate research, I can start working on this the next day. This might be a little bit harder in industry. If you're working in a research lab, it's still okay. You're working on, say, an application towards search, and you're collaborating with teams in search, like say Google search. Tomorrow, if you say you want to move to something else, you want to move to, say, recommendation systems, you can then collaborate with another team in Google with recommendation systems, right? So this is just an example, but basically what I mean is that you can switch topics in a research lab and still you can make impact to the company. In an industry lab, on the other hand, you're working with a specific team. The team is working on a specific problem like Google search, but oftentimes the team is not going to work on the entirety of search, but a very specific aspect of search, like say for example relevance or click prediction. So for that reason, your role or your job is very narrow towards that problem. You can switch jobs, of course. You can move to another company or another team in the same company, and from that perspective you can get breadth and you have some freedom, but it's obviously not as much as what you have in a research lab or in academia. The last point which is related to this is how narrow your work is. As you can expect, academia is going to be the least narrow because, as I said, you can change your field completely. You have complete freedom. You can be very broad. Also, you work on algorithmic ideas and your algorithms can be applied to multiple applications. So for example, I work on label efficient learning, machine learning, like say active learning. I can apply active learning to multiple domains. I can apply it to search, I can apply it to ads, I can apply it to recommendation systems, I can apply it to even housing, price prediction. So I can, apply it to various applications, and so from that perspective, it's very broad. Research labs, also you have the breadth because you're working on algorithms. You develop an algorithm, you can collaborate with multiple product teams, and you have the breadth of the research. On the other hand, industry labs and startups are going to be very narrow. You're going to be focused on the very specific project you're working on. Like even in search, you don't work on the entire search, like say in Google, right? You work on a small component within search that your team is responsible for, like for example click prediction or relevance, right? Similarly, within YouTube or recommendation system, your team is going to be focused on a very specific aspect of YouTube that you're going to try to develop and try to make better, right? So hopefully I have given you multiple points that you can trade off between all of these different four options that you can go for: academia, a research lab, industry lab, and a startup. I'd like to end by actually talking a little bit about my own personal experience. So I have had the fortune of actually working in all four of these environments. So I did my PhD obviously, and I did a postdoc, and currently now I'm a assistant professor at University of Texas at Dallas. So I have had quite a lot of experience in academia. I've had experience in grant writing, in publishing papers, mentoring students, and working with graduate students, teaching courses in universities, so on and so forth. After my PhD, I actually didn't go the conventional route, and I in fact joined a academic lab. So not even a research lab, I joined an academic lab. So I did more industry work focused on a specific product. In fact, I worked on a product in advertisements, in search advertisements. And I worked on multiple components in search advertisements. And honestly speaking, the time that I spent in industry, I learned a lot. Even though I was working on a very narrow aspect of a problem and a very specific machine learning problem, I actually learned about what is the impact that your work can have on real world, and also how basically to think about research problems and how to frame research problems from a real world perspective, and how to basically start from the problem and then design algorithms to solve the problems. I also learned actually that dealing with the real world data is a very different ball game than dealing with academic data. So academic data is actually very clean. It has been collected. Multiple people have cleaned the data. Multiple people have run benchmarks on the data. So this is a very clean, nice data set. You can focus on running algorithms in this setting. On the other hand, in the real world, if you're working in a startup or an industry lab, the real world data is very messy. A lot of time that you spend is actually going to be focused on not the algorithm, but actually things like cleaning the data set. You're going to be working on the data ingestion pipeline. You're going to be working on figuring out feature correlations, so on and so forth, right? So this actually helped me a lot in contextualizing and actually grounding a lot of my research in this. I also did spend some time in between in a startup. In fact, I was a co-founder and advisor to a startup. And currently, while in academia, I'm actually advising multiple startups and collaborating with multiple startups. So I have had, all right, so the last is actually a research lab, and actually I did 2 internships at Microsoft Research. So I got to very closely see the workings of the research lab. So a lot of what I spoke about today is also my personal experience. I have seen this working in a research lab, in an industry lab, working now in academia, and working in a startup. A lot of what I mentioned, all of these points and the trade-offs is my personal experience. It may not be 100% true and applicable to everyone. There are of course caveats for everything, right? So take whatever I said obviously with a pinch of salt, but hopefully this will give you at least a ballpark of what to expect in each of these different positions. I'd like to conclude by actually mentioning one thing, that it is, at least personally, I believe that it is not the case that one job is better than the other. Whoever tells you that an academic job is better than an industry job, an academic job is better than an industry lab, a startup is better than an industry lab, a research lab is better than an industry lab, it's not true at all. Everyone needs to choose the job based on their internal preference and liking. I personally might like doing more algorithmic research and blue sky research, but my friend who has graduated from the same university might actually thoroughly enjoy himself working with the messy real world and trying to make real world impact by using algorithms in solving the real world. He may not need to develop new algorithms even. He may use existing algorithms but show impact of existing algorithms on real world and show impact towards the product. So two people are different. Do not ever feel that one job is better than the other and feel bad if you're working in a certain job. The most important thing is, are you happy in the role you're working with? I also want to mention that it might be the case that you might start off in a particular position and you may not like it as much. You may want to switch, maybe for a certain reason at that point. It's okay. Like I myself, after doing my PhD, as I said, I worked in a startup and then I joined industry lab. I worked at Microsoft for 3 years. And towards the end of my time at Microsoft, I felt that I should come back to academia, right? So I came back as an assistant professor. So I'll talk maybe in another video of my journey, how I came back to academia and the challenges that I faced. In fact, I have a Twitter thread that talks about it, but this is another topic. So it is possible. I was able to come from an industry lab into academia. It's a little harder and requires much more effort. But what is also more common is folks have been in academia for some time, realize that they don't like academia. They have switched over to a research lab or switched over to an industry lab. Multiple folks have switched over from research labs to industry labs. They have switched from Microsoft Research to a product team in Microsoft because that is what fits them better. So even if you do make a choice, it is okay. It is totally okay to switch, right? So if you feel that at any point maybe working in another kind of a problem would be better, if you're working in academic or blue sky research, you are feeling burnt out by doing academic research, you want to do maybe more applied work and you want to work in an industry lab, that is totally fine as well, right? So hopefully this video was useful to you. I spent a lot of time thinking about this video and how to put this video across. So if you really enjoyed this video, then please leave comments down. I would like to learn about what topics to talk about next. My main goal of shooting these kind of videos is to actually educate and provide my personal experience and my journey to all of you. So hopefully this will be useful for you in your career and choosing your career trajectory. Again, lastly, please do subscribe to my channel and please like this video. Thank you so much. Have a nice day and see you guys soon.